Hey friends, welcome back to the final reflection for this week. So as we look at today's readings, starting with Hebrews chapter 8, looking at verses 6 through 13, the first words or maybe phrase that stuck out to me from today's first reading, how our author describes how Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant enacted on better promises. Now, I hope this doesn't get stuck in your head, but when I read this first verse found in today's first reading, I couldn't help but think of the Papa John's slogan, better ingredients, better pizza, Papa John's. What does our author mean by a better promise or better covenant? This is to say that one preceding this was not as good. And that's precisely what the author is trying to communicate today as he starts to shift the focus in the letter to the Hebrews regarding old and new covenants. For if that first covenant had been faultless, essentially there would be no need for a better one or for a second one. So let's do a quick compare and contrast of the first and second covenant, or the old and new, the not so good one and the better one. You see, the old covenant, or the first covenant, was a covenant made by God through Moses, first introduced as they were leaving Egypt, where they had been held captive, and Moses comes to free the Israelites. This was the covenant of the law. Now, what made this law or covenant faultless was largely due to the fact that the people that received this covenant were not following it. We certainly wouldn't be able to follow it either. The scriptures continue on, and he reminds us of another passage that's found in, I believe, Jeremiah, where the scriptures say, I will put the law on their minds and write it on their hearts. I think a question that we should consider then is, what makes this new covenant better? Continuing on with the verses in today's first reading, we see that he will be their God, and they shall be his people. That with this new covenant, and most important of all, God would forgive their sins and no more remember them. And as we turn to today's gospel that's found in Mark chapter 3, the mission of the 12, it begs the question, so what does today's gospel have to do with today's first reading, and how do these ultimately connect to one another? As I was praying with the scriptures, the Lord specifically revealed to me the importance of why Jesus chose the 12 disciples. If Jesus had come to fulfill this new covenant, as the prophets had prophesied about, which would mean that the first one that they had already learned about and had generations of generations passing down the details of this covenant, if at all of a sudden this is now obsolete and Jesus is coming and preaching the news of this new covenant, well, let's just think about this practically for a second. How do you essentially renew the minds of people who've been taught something that's been passed on from generation to generation? We have to almost restart a new generation passing down this information so that people like you and me have access to it. And so today's gospel reveals actually a very beautiful picture of not just the new covenant, but a new instruction of passing down the information in order that it would even reach you and I. And there's a job that we have today as Christians, that we too must continue on the succession of this good news to ensure that not only our children, but their children and grandchildren, and even those beyond that, will understand the good news of Christ. So the appointing of the 12 apostles in today's gospel is absolutely crucial. He appointed the 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them forth to preach and to have authority to drive out the demons. You see, just as Moses had chosen and appointed leaders to continue on the succession of God's law, Jesus institutes a similar succession plan, starting with the 12 apostles. And that's why I think what we believe as Catholics regarding apostolic succession is incredibly important. And it's the only reason that we have access to what was entrusted to the apostles. And apostolic succession was ultimately a way to preserve true doctrine. And they were chosen to carry out the witness of Christ. Friends, I don't know if you know this, But one of the most amazing things that I've come to learn is that our bishops can actually trace their ordination back to one of the original 12 apostles. And I've jokingly said this before, but I'm sure many churches in America probably couldn't even tell you the first custodian that they hired on payroll. What a gift that we have as Catholics, that the true doctrine and the witness of Christ has been carried and passed on since this moment that we read about in today's gospel. And while we can thank the apostles who have been diligent in preserving the true doctrine and carrying out the message of reconciliation that they were entrusted with, that God would be reconciling the world to himself through Christ, we too have been entrusted with our own apostolic action to ensure that others know the good news of Jesus. This is one of the greatest things I've come to learn, is that the laity of the church has a direct call to action. You see, this mission is not just exclusive to the apostles, the priests, the clergy. We too have been given ordination where we are. The Lord is calling on us to take our own apostolic action. So, a couple questions to consider from today's reflection. First, the scriptures say in today's first reading, "I will put my law on their minds and write it on their hearts." How is your relationship with Christ transforming you? And how is the Holy Spirit guiding you and changing the way you think and act? This is what I think of when I think of that verse. And finally, where is the Holy Spirit challenging you to take your own apostolic action? Friends, once again, I'm grateful for you. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Until then, God bless.